Does a single dollar have the power to rewrite the course of two lives forever? On a bitterly cold November evening in 1987, the streets of Boston glistened with fresh rain. The city's heartbeat pulsed through crowded avenues, but in the shadowed doorway of an abandoned textile factory on Mercer Street, one man sat alone, invisible to the thousands rushing past. His name was Thomas Whitmore, and at 63 years old, he looked like a ghost of the person he once was. His coat, threadbare and stained, hung loosely on his thin frame. His fingers, numb from the cold, clutched a worn leather briefcase, the only possession he refused to part with, even when hunger clawed at his insides. Thomas wasn't always homeless. Once, his name appeared in newspapers. His signature closed million-dollar deals. He had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small manufacturing company into one of New England's most successful enterprises. But success, he learned, was as fragile as trust. A business partner's betrayal, a series of catastrophic investments, and a legal battle that drained every cent he had. Within 18 months, Thomas lost everything. His wife left. His colleagues vanished. The mansion in Cambridge became a memory, replaced by cardboard and concrete. That evening, as darkness swallowed the last traces of daylight, Thomas hadn't eaten in 2 days. His stomach had stopped growling hours ago, replaced by a hollow numbness that made even thinking difficult. He watched people pass, couples laughing, businessmen checking watches, students chattering about weekend plans. To them, he was invisible, just another shadow in a city full of forgotten people. Then she appeared. A young woman, no more than 25, stepped out of the corner deli across the street. She wore a faded green jacket, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. There was something different about her, something in the way she moved. Purposeful yet gentle, as if she carried the weight of the world but refused to let it break her stride. Her name was Elena Vasquez, though Thomas wouldn't learn that until later. She worked 3 jobs to support her younger brother's college tuition after their parents died in a car accident 2 years prior. Every morning at 5, she cleaned office buildings. Afternoons, she waited tables at the deli. Evenings, she stocked shelves at the 24-hour grocery store 2 blocks down. Elena's shift had just ended. In her pocket, she carried $23, everything she had until Friday's paycheck, still 4 days away. She'd already calculated it down to the cent. $18 for her brother's textbook deposit due tomorrow, $3 for the subway, and $2 for tomorrow's lunch. That left her with exactly nothing, but she'd learned to survive on nothing before. She crossed the street, her sneakers splashing through puddles, when something made her stop. Maybe it was the way Thomas sat so perfectly still, like a statue carved from despair. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, not begging, not demanding, just existing in a space beyond hope. Elena had passed countless homeless people before. She gave when she could, smiled when she couldn't. But this was different. She stood there for a long moment, her hand unconsciously moving to her pocket, fingers brushing against the crumpled bills. Her mind raced through the calculations again. The textbook deposit, the subway fare, tomorrow's meal. But something deeper pulled at her, something beyond logic or reason. A whisper in her heart that said this moment mattered more than any spreadsheet of survival could measure. Elena walked toward him. Thomas didn't look up at first, accustomed to people's footsteps passing by. But these footsteps stopped. He raised his eyes slowly and found himself looking into a face that held no pity, no judgment, only recognition. The recognition that he was still human, still here, still worth seeing. "Excuse me," she said softly. Her voice carried a slight accent, remnants of a childhood spent speaking Spanish before English. "I know this isn't much, but..." She pulled out a $1 bill from her pocket. Not the 23 she carried, but $1 she'd found in her jacket lining that morning, forgotten from weeks ago. "Please take it. Get something warm." Thomas stared at the bill, then at her. In that moment, something cracked inside him, not breaking but opening. He saw in her eyes the same exhaustion he felt, the same battle against a world that demanded more than seemed possible to give. Yet here she stood, offering what little she had. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. But as he reached for the dollar, his hand trembled and knocked against the briefcase beside him. It fell open, spilling its contents onto the wet pavement. Elena instinctively knelt to help, and that's when she saw them. Dozens of documents, yellowed with age and worn at the edges. Business contracts, property deeds, stock certificates. All in Thomas's name, all dated from years ago. All technically worthless now, but preserved like precious relics of a life that once was. "I'm sorry," she said, carefully gathering the papers. "I didn't mean to." "It's all right," Thomas said, and for the first time in months, something like a smile ghosted across his face. "They're just memories now. Proof that I was someone once." Elena handed back the papers, their fingers touching briefly. In that touch, something passed between them. An understanding, a connection, a recognition that both their lives had led them to this exact moment for reasons neither could yet comprehend. She stood, gave him one last gentle smile and turned to leave. Thomas watched her walk away, the single dollar clutched in his hand, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not just gratitude, but purpose. This stranger, this young woman who clearly had almost nothing herself, had given him more than money. She had given him proof that he still existed in someone's world. What Thomas didn't know was that Elena's simple act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would transform both their lives in ways neither could imagine. And what Elena didn't know was that the broken old man in the doorway would soon remember something he'd forgotten, something hidden in those yellowed papers, something worth far more than either of them dreamed possible. But that revelation was still to come, waiting in the days ahead like a secret the universe had been keeping all along. Retry tea. Thomas sat in that doorway long after Elena disappeared into the city's maze of lights and shadows. The dollar bill rested in his palm, but it wasn't the money that held his attention. It was the weight of being seen, of being treated like a person rather than a problem to step around. He looked down at his briefcase, at the scattered papers now damp from the pavement, and something sparked in the fog of his exhausted mind. A memory, a detail he'd buried beneath months of survival and despair. His fingers moved almost automatically, sorting through the documents with sudden urgency. Stock certificates from companies long dissolved, property deeds for a house the bank had seized, business contracts with signatures of men who'd profited from his downfall. But then, near the bottom, his hand stopped. A single envelope, sealed and forgotten, with a law firm's embossed logo in the corner. Whitmore and Associates. The firm his grandfather had founded in 1923 passed down through 3 generations until Thomas's own legal troubles forced him to sell it for pennies on the dollar to settle debts. Or so he thought. He'd never opened this envelope. It had arrived in the mail just days before he lost his home, buried in an avalanche of foreclosure notices and creditor demands. In the chaos of losing everything, he'd thrown it in the briefcase and forgotten it existed. Now, with trembling fingers and the distant glow of a street lamp providing barely enough light, he tore it open. Inside was a letter dated 18 months ago, and as Thomas read the words, his heart began to pound with an intensity that made his chest ache. The law firm he thought he'd sold, the transaction had never been completed. The buyer, his former business partner Richard Castellano, the same man who'd orchestrated Thomas's downfall, had been arrested for fraud 3 weeks after their deal. The sale was nullified by federal investigators as part of a larger criminal case. According to the letter, the firm had reverted to Thomas's ownership by default. But there was more. Much more. During the months Thomas spent descending into homelessness, believing he owned nothing, the firm had been managed by a court-appointed trustee. And through a series of unexpected legal victories and settlements from Castellanos' seized assets, the firm had not only survived but begun to recover. The letter included a statement, the firm's current valuation, and Thomas's equity position. He read the number once, then again, certain his hunger-addled mind was playing tricks. $4.7 million. Thomas's hands shook so violently the paper slipped from his grasp. He sat there, staring at nothing, his breath coming in short gasps. For 18 months, he'd slept on streets, dug through trash for food, and watched pieces of his soul chip away with each passing day, all while technically being a millionaire. The irony was so cruel, it would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. But the letter was dated months ago. There were instructions, contact information for the trustee, deadlines for claiming the assets. Had he missed them? Was this just another phantom of what might have been? Thomas's mind raced through calculations. What day was it? November 18th. The letter said he had until December 1st to contact the trustee and verify his identity, or the assets would be liquidated and distributed to secondary creditors. He had 13 days. Thomas looked down at the dollar bill still in his hand, and something crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. This young woman, this complete stranger, had given him what no one else could. Not money, but a reminder that he mattered. That small act of recognition had pulled him back from a place where he'd been slowly disappearing, even from himself. It had cleared his mind enough to sort through those papers, to find this envelope, to remember that he was once a man who solved problems instead of embodying them. He struggled to his feet, his joints protesting, his head swimming with hunger and disbelief, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. The briefcase clutched to his chest. Thomas began walking. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew he needed help. Real help. The kind you can't get from a shelter or a soup kitchen. He needed to look like someone a lawyer's office would let through the door. 3 blocks away on Boylston Street, Thomas found what he was looking for. A church, its doors still open despite the late hour, light spilling out onto the sidewalk where a sign read, "Community Outreach Services, all welcome." Inside, a middle-aged priest was stacking chairs after what looked like an evening meeting. Father Michael Chen looked up as Thomas entered, and unlike so many others, his expression didn't change to one of wariness or discomfort. Instead, he simply smiled. "Come in, please. You look like you could use somewhere warm to sit." "I need help," Thomas said, his voice cracking, "but not the kind you might think." Over the next hour, Thomas told his story to Father Chen, showing him the letter, explaining his situation. The priest listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, his eyes growing wider as the full picture emerged. When Thomas finished, Father Chen sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "This is extraordinary," he finally said. "But you're going to need more than this letter to reclaim your life. You need identification, documentation, a way to prove you are who you say you are. You need to look like Thomas Whitmore, the businessman, not..." He paused delicately. "Not a homeless man," Thomas finished. "I know." Father Chen made a decision. "Stay here tonight. Tomorrow morning we'll start making calls. I know people, lawyers who do pro bono work, social services who can help expedite ID replacement. We have a fund for situations like this. We can get you cleaned up, get you proper clothes." "But Thomas..." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "This is going to take time. Maybe more time than you have. These processes don't move quickly, even in extraordinary circumstances." Thomas spent that night on a cot in the church basement, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Elena. He kept seeing her face, the gentle determination in her eyes as she handed him that dollar. She'd had no idea what she was setting in motion. She'd probably forgotten about him already, moved on with her life of working 3 jobs and scraping by. He didn't even know her name. But Thomas knew something with absolute certainty. If he managed to reclaim his fortune, if he navigated the bureaucratic maze and met that December 1st deadline, he would find her. He would repay what she'd given him, not just $1, but something infinitely more valuable. She had given him his life back, even if she didn't know it, and somehow he would do the same for her. The next 10 days became a blur of activity that would have been impossible for Thomas to navigate alone. Father Chen proved to be extraordinarily well connected. He called in favors from legal aid attorneys, expedited appointments at the Social Security office, and even convinced a local businessman to donate a suit that fit Thomas reasonably well. Each day, Thomas looked a little more like his old self. A haircut, a shave, meals that didn't come from dumpsters. But the real transformation was internal, the return of purpose, the rekindling of the sharp mind that had once built an empire. The law firm's trustee, a woman named Margaret Ashford, was skeptical when Thomas first contacted her. But Father Chen's legal aid attorney had prepared a compelling case, and when Thomas sat across from Margaret in her downtown office 5 days later, dressed in his donated suit and carrying every piece of documentation they'd managed to assemble, something shifted in her expression. "Mr. Whitmore," she said slowly, studying his face and comparing it to an old photo on file. "I have to be honest. We assumed you were dead. When you didn't respond to our letters, when we couldn't locate you through any normal channels, we thought..." She paused. "Where have you been?" "Living proof that rock bottom has a basement," Thomas said quietly. "But I'm here now, and I'm asking for a chance to reclaim what's mine." Margaret was thorough, meticulous, and initially unmoved by Thomas's story. But over the course of that meeting and 2 more that followed, she verified every detail. Fingerprints matched. Old business associates were contacted and confirmed his identity. A background check revealed no death certificate, no criminal record beyond the civil cases that had destroyed him financially. By November 28th, 3 days before the deadline, Margaret Ashford made her decision. "Welcome back, Mr. Whitmore," she said, extending her hand. "You've just reclaimed your life." Thomas walked out of that office as a wealthy man, but wealth felt different now than it had before. Money had once been a measure of success, a scoreboard in a game he'd been winning. Now it was something else entirely, a tool, a responsibility, a chance to do what money was always meant to do, but rarely did: change lives the way his had been changed. He thought of Elena constantly. That young woman who'd given her last dollar to a stranger, who'd seen humanity where others saw only a problem. Thomas was determined to find her, but Boston was a massive city and he had only fragments of information. A faded green jacket, a corner deli on Mercer Street, dark hair in a ponytail. It wasn't much, but Thomas had built a fortune on less. He would find her, no matter how long it took. What Thomas didn't know, as he began his search, was that Elena's life had taken its own unexpected turn. The morning after she'd given him that $1, she'd arrived at the college bursar's office with $18 for her brother's textbook deposit, only to discover the price had increased. $19, $1 short. Her brother Miguel had been forced to withdraw from his chemistry class, jeopardizing his scholarship and his entire academic future. Elena had spent the past 10 days drowning in guilt, wondering if that single dollar she'd given away might have been the one that changed everything for the person who mattered most in her world. She'd made a choice that felt right in her heart, and now she was living with consequences that felt unbearably wrong. 2 strangers, both transformed by a single dollar, both carrying the weight of what that moment meant. Their paths would cross again, that much was certain. But when they did, neither would be the same person who'd stood in that doorway on Mercer Street, and the conversation they would have would reshape everything they thought they understood about generosity, sacrifice, and the invisible threads that connect human lives in ways we never see coming. Retry tea. Thomas stood on the corner of Mercer Street, staring at the deli where Elena had emerged that night. The neon sign flickered overhead, Mario's Deli and Groceries, casting irregular patterns of red and white across the wet pavement. It had been raining again, the kind of persistent November drizzle that turns the city into a watercolor painting, all blurred edges and muted colors. He'd been coming here every day for a week, watching, waiting, hoping to catch a glimpse of that faded green jacket, that purposeful stride. But she never appeared. Inside the deli, the owner, a heavy-set man in his 60s with flour dusting his apron, looked up as Thomas entered. The smell of fresh bread and roasting coffee filled the small space, triggering a memory so sharp it hurt. Thomas used to stop at places like this every morning before his fall, never noticing the people behind the counter, never thinking about their stories. Now, he saw everything differently. "Help you?" Mario asked, his accent thick with the cadence of southern Italy. "I'm looking for someone who works here," Thomas said. A young woman, mid-20s, dark hair. She was wearing a green jacket about 2 weeks ago. "I think she might wait tables." Mario's expression shifted, something guarded moving behind his eyes. "Why are you looking for her?" "I owe her something," Thomas said simply. "Something important." The old man studied him for a long moment, taking in the expensive suit, the clean-shaven face, the leather shoes that probably cost more than a week's worth of deli receipts. Whatever calculation he was making, Thomas apparently passed. Mario sighed heavily. "Elena, she worked here, yeah, good girl, very good girl, but she don't work here no more." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "What happened?" "She quit. Maybe 10 days ago. Came in one morning, said she needed to take more hours at her other jobs. She was crying, you know. Wouldn't tell me why, but I know Elena 3 years now. Something broke inside her that day." Mario wiped his hands on his apron, his expression troubled. "You say you owe her something?" "More than I could ever repay," Thomas said. "Do you know where I can find her? Her other jobs, maybe?" Mario hesitated, the protective instinct of someone who'd watched Elena struggle and survive, warring with something he saw in Thomas's face. Finally, he reached under the counter and pulled out a worn notepad, scribbling an address. "She cleans buildings early morning, starts at one of the office towers on State Street, Morrison Building, I think. Goes there around 5:30 a.m. before the business people arrive." He handed Thomas the paper. "But mister, if you do something to hurt that girl, you answer to me and half this neighborhood. Capisce?" "I understand," Thomas said, "and I promise I'm going to help her." That night, Thomas barely slept. He arrived at the Morrison Building at 5:15 the next morning, when the city was still draped in darkness and the streets belonged to delivery trucks and insomniacs. He waited across the street, drinking coffee from a paper cup that had long since gone cold, watching the building's service entrance. At 5:40, he saw her. Elena looked different than he remembered, though it had only been 2 weeks. There was something diminished about her, a heaviness in her movements that hadn't been there before. She wore the same green jacket, but now Thomas could see how threadbare it really was, how inadequate against the November cold. She carried a large canvas bag over her shoulder and moved with the mechanical efficiency of someone running on empty. Thomas started to cross the street, then stopped himself. What was he going to say? How do you approach someone whose small kindness had accidentally saved your life without sounding completely insane? And more importantly, he realized with sudden clarity, how do you give someone millions of dollars without destroying the very thing that made them give you that dollar in the first place? He'd been so focused on finding her, on repaying her, that he hadn't thought through what that actually meant. Thomas had learned the hard way that money changed everything: relationships, motivations, the way people saw you and themselves. Elena had given from a place of pure compassion, expecting nothing in return. If he showed up now with a check, with an offer to solve all her problems, would that honor what she'd done or cheapen it? Thomas watched her disappear into the building and made a decision. He needed to understand who Elena really was before he changed her life forever. He needed to know her story, her struggles, what she dreamed about in those quiet moments between exhaustion and sleep. Only then could he figure out how to help her in a way that wouldn't break something essential inside her. Over the next several days, Thomas became a ghost in Elena's orbit. He learned her schedule through observation and discreet questions to people in her world. 5:30 to 8 a.m., she cleaned offices in the Morrison building. 9 to 3 p.m., she'd disappeared somewhere. He'd later discover she was caring for her brother, making sure Miguel got to class, helping him study, being the parent he'd lost. At 4 p.m., she stocked shelves at Henderson's Grocery on Cambridge Street, working until midnight, sometimes later. Then she'd take the subway home to a cramped apartment in Dorchester where she'd sleep for maybe 4 hours before starting again. Thomas hired a private investigator, a discreet man named Jack Reynolds, who asked no questions and delivered thorough reports. Through Jack, Thomas learned the full story. Elena and Miguel Vasquez, orphaned when their parents were killed by a drunk driver on Interstate 93. No extended family in the country. Their parents had immigrated from Guatemala before the children were born, severing ties with relatives who disapproved of their decision to leave. Elena had been 23, working as a paralegal assistant with dreams of law school. Miguel had been 15, a sophomore in high school with exceptional grades and a gift for chemistry. The drunk driver had no insurance. The settlement from the estate had barely covered funeral costs. Elena had dropped out of college 3 credits short of her degree to work full-time, supporting Miguel, making sure he'd have the chance she'd surrendered. For 2 years, she'd held their small world together through sheer force of will, working herself to exhaustion, sacrificing everything so her brother could have a future. And then she'd given Thomas that dollar. The investigator's report included something else, a detail that made Thomas's chest tighten. The day after Elena had given him that dollar, Miguel had been forced to withdraw from his chemistry class because she'd been $1 short of the textbook deposit. Without that class, Miguel's GPA had dropped below the threshold for his scholarship. He was now at risk of losing everything. The school had given him until the end of the semester to raise his grades or find alternative funding, but chemistry was only offered in the fall. Missing it meant graduating a year late, if at all. Thomas sat in his newly rented apartment. He wasn't ready for anything lavish yet, still feeling more comfortable with modest spaces, and stared at that detail in the report for a long time. Elena's single act of kindness had cost her the one thing she'd sacrificed everything to protect: her brother's future. And she'd made that choice knowingly. The investigator had interviewed Mario, who'd mentioned that Elena had come to work crying the morning she'd learned about Miguel's situation. She told Mario through her tears, "I'd make the same choice again. That man needed to know someone cared. Miguel will understand someday." But Miguel didn't understand. According to the report, there was growing tension between the siblings. Miguel felt guilty that his sister was destroying herself for him. Elena felt guilty that her moment of compassion had jeopardized his dreams. They were trapped in a cycle of sacrifice and guilt, each trying to protect the other, both drowning in the attempt. Thomas realized then that this wasn't simple. He couldn't just write a check and solve everything. Money could fix Miguel's scholarship and Elena's exhaustion, but it couldn't repair what was breaking between them. It couldn't address the deeper question that haunted them both. What was the right choice when helping a stranger might hurt the person you loved most? He thought about his own life, about the choices that had led him to that doorway. He'd spent decades chasing wealth, believing it was the measure of a life well lived. He'd made ruthless business decisions, prioritized profit over people, told himself it was necessary. And where had it led? To betrayal, bankruptcy, and a cardboard box on Mercer Street. Elena had almost nothing, yet she'd given freely. She'd made the harder choice, the one that cost her something real. Thomas understood now that finding Elena had been the easy part, figuring out how to help her without destroying what made her who she was. That was the real challenge. And he was running out of time. According to the investigators' latest update, Elena had taken out a predatory payday loan to cover some of Miguel's expenses. The interest rates were criminally high. She was sinking deeper into a hole that money could fill, but only if presented in the right way, at the right time, for the right reasons. He needed a plan, not just a financial one, but a human one. Something that would honor what Elena had given him while helping her in a way that didn't rob her of agency or dignity. Thomas had spent his whole career solving complex problems, navigating impossible situations, finding solutions where others saw only obstacles. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was about understanding that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't money, but the chance to keep being who they are while no longer having to suffer for it. 3 more days passed. Thomas refined his approach, consulting with Father Chen, who'd become an unexpected advisor and friend. The priest listened to Thomas's dilemma and offered perspective that cut through the complexity. "You're overthinking this," Father Chen said one evening over coffee in the church office. "Elena gave you $1 without knowing your story. She saw a human being in need and responded with whatever she had. You want to do the same. Respond to her need with whatever you have. The difference is scale, not intention. Don't insult her compassion by making your response more complicated than hers was." "But the money, it changes everything," Thomas protested. "Only if you make it about the money," Father Chen replied. "Make it about the recognition. She saw you. Now you see her. Everything else is just mechanics." Thomas sat with that wisdom, turning it over in his mind. Father Chen was right. He'd been so worried about how to give that he'd forgotten why Elena had given in the first place. She hadn't calculated or strategized. She'd simply responded to a moment of human connection with whatever she had to offer. The next morning, Thomas woke with clarity. He knew what he needed to do, but he also knew he needed one more piece of the puzzle. He needed to understand what Elena truly wanted, not what he thought she needed. And there was only one way to get that answer. He dressed carefully, not in his expensive suit, but in simple clothes that wouldn't intimidate or create distance. At 5:20 a.m., he was waiting outside the Morrison building when Elena arrived. This time, he didn't hide. He stepped forward, and when she looked up, recognition flickered across her face. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city hummed around them. Distant traffic, the hiss of a steam grate, the first whispers of a world waking up. But in that space between recognition and reaction, Thomas saw something in Elena's eyes that changed everything he thought he understood about that night 2 weeks ago. It wasn't just compassion he saw, it was regret, retrite. Elena froze when she saw him. Her eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Thomas thought she might turn and run, but she didn't. She just stood there, her canvas bag slipping slightly down her shoulder, her breath visible in the cold morning air. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You're not," she started, then stopped, confusion and something else, hope, maybe, or fear, playing across her face. "You look different." "I am different," Thomas said gently. "Because of you." Elena shook her head, and to his surprise, her eyes filled with tears. "Don't say that. Please don't say that." She looked away, down at the pavement, anywhere but at him. "I shouldn't have. That $1, I needed it. My brother needed it. I made a choice that hurt the person I love most in this world, and I've been carrying that guilt every single day since." Thomas felt his heart break a little. All this time, he'd been thinking about how to repay her, how to honor her gift. He'd never considered that she might be drowning in regret, second-guessing the very act of kindness that had saved his life. "Elena," he said softly, "can we talk? Just for a few minutes. I promise you'll still have time to get to work." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in his expression must have convinced her. She nodded, and they walked to a small cafe that was just opening, its windows glowing with warm light against the darkness. Inside, the owner was arranging pastries in the display case. Thomas ordered 2 coffees, and they sat at a corner table, the city slowly coming to life beyond the window. "How do you know my name?" Elena asked, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "I found you," Thomas admitted. "I've been looking for you since that night. I needed to tell you what that dollar meant, what you meant. But first, I need to tell you something about who I was and who I became." And so Thomas told her everything. About his former life, the betrayal, the loss, the months of sleeping in doorways and believing he'd ceased to matter. About the envelope he'd carried without opening, the fortune he'd reclaimed, and how none of it would have happened if she hadn't stopped that night and seen him as human. He told her about Father Chen, about the race to meet the deadline, about becoming a wealthy man again but feeling it differently this time. Not as an achievement but as a responsibility. Elena listened without interrupting, her coffee growing cold between her hands. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I don't understand," she finally said. "You're telling me that my giving you $1 somehow gave you back millions? That doesn't make sense. You would have found that envelope eventually." "Would I?" Thomas asked. "Elena, I was disappearing. Every day I lost a little more of myself. I'd stopped sorting through those papers weeks before you found me. I'd stopped caring about who I used to be. I was just trying to survive each moment, and surviving was getting harder. That night, I don't think I would have made it through the winter." He paused, making sure she heard the weight of what he was saying. "You didn't give me $1. You gave me a reason to care again. You reminded me that I was still worth something, even when I'd forgotten it myself. That's what made me look through those papers. That's what saved my life." Elena's tears spilled over then, running down her cheeks. "But Miguel, my brother, lost his scholarship because I was $1 short. $1, the same dollar I gave you." "I know," Thomas said quietly. "I know about Miguel, about the chemistry class, about everything you've sacrificed, and I know you've been carrying the guilt of that choice. But Elena, can I tell you what I see when I look at you?" She nodded, unable to speak. "I see someone who chose compassion over calculation. You didn't know my story. You didn't know what that dollar would mean. You just saw another human being and responded with what you had. That's not something to regret. That's something rare and precious. Miguel's situation isn't your fault. It's the fault of a system that makes people choose between helping a stranger and protecting their family. But your choice? That was beautiful. That was exactly what this broken world needs more of." "It cost him everything," Elena whispered. "It cost him a semester," Thomas corrected gently. "And I'm here to tell you that it doesn't have to cost him anything more." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, a deliberate echo of the one that had changed his life. "This is a cashier's check for $500,000. It's yours. Not as payment, not as charity, but as recognition that what you gave me was worth infinitely more than this piece of paper. Use it for Miguel's education. Use it to finish your own degree. Use it to stop working 3 jobs and actually sleep. Use it however you need to." Elena stared at the envelope like it might explode. She didn't touch it. "I can't take that. It's too much. I didn't give you that dollar expecting anything in return." "I know," Thomas said. "That's exactly why I'm giving this to you. Elena, you taught me something that night. You taught me that generosity isn't about what you can afford to give. It's about giving what matters despite what it costs you. That dollar was meaningful because it mattered to you, because giving it was a sacrifice. This money matters to me now in a way it never did before, and the only way I can honor what you taught me is to give it where it will mean something. Elena finally touched the envelope, her fingers trembling. I don't know what to say. Say you'll stop carrying guilt for choosing compassion, Thomas said. Say you'll let this help you and Miguel rebuild. Say you'll remember that one act of kindness can ripple out in ways we never see coming, and that's not something to regret. That's something to celebrate. They sat there for a while longer, talking about what came next. Thomas explained that he was rebuilding his life differently this time, making choices based on values rather than just profits. He'd established a foundation to help people experiencing homelessness, working with Father Chen to create programs that treated people with dignity rather than just processing them through a system. He was using his second chance to be someone his first life had never allowed him to become. Elena told him about Miguel, about his dreams of becoming a doctor, about how brilliant he was when he wasn't crushed under the weight of guilt and pressure. She talked about her own abandoned dreams of becoming a lawyer, of helping people navigate systems that seemed designed to trap them. Thomas listened and saw in her the same kind of sharp intelligence and determination that had once made him successful, but tempered with something he'd lacked. Empathy, wisdom, a bone-deep understanding of what it meant to struggle. You should finish your degree, he said, and not just because I'm giving you the means to do it, because you'd be an extraordinary lawyer. Because people like you, who've lived through real hardship, make the kind of advocates this world desperately needs. When Elena finally left to start her shift, promising to deposit the check and give her notice at the jobs that were slowly killing her, Thomas sat alone in the cafe and watched the city come fully alive outside. Business people rushed past with their lattes and their briefcases, every one of them lost in their own urgent concerns, none of them seeing each other. He wondered how many moments of potential connection slipped past unnoticed every day, how many times people who needed each other most passed like ships in the darkness. 6 months later, Thomas stood in a university auditorium watching Miguel Vasquez receive an award for academic excellence. The young man was thriving now, the weight of impossible circumstances lifted, his natural brilliance finally able to shine without being smothered by stress and exhaustion. Elena sat beside Thomas, wearing the cap and gown of someone about to graduate with honors from the paralegal program she'd restarted. She'd decided to work for a few years before law school, wanting to help her community immediately rather than waiting another 3 years. After the ceremony, the three of them went to dinner at a modest restaurant. Thomas had suggested somewhere fancy, but Elena had insisted on the small Italian place where Mario still served the best lasagna in Boston. The old man had wept when Elena told him her story, had insisted the meal was on the house, had treated Thomas with a grudging respect that gradually warmed into something like friendship. I've been thinking about that night, Elena said as they shared cannoli for dessert. About what it meant, what it means, and I realized something. We both gave what we couldn't afford to lose. I gave money I needed. You were carrying all those papers, holding on to your past, even though you thought it was worthless. You could have thrown them away, traveled lighter, but you didn't. You held on to them. And because you did, because you wouldn't let go of who you'd been even when it seemed pointless, you were ready when the moment came. Thomas hadn't thought about it that way. She was right. He'd clung to those documents not because they had obvious value, but because they were all he had left of his former self. That stubbornness, that refusal to completely surrender his past, had positioned him to recognize the opportunity when Elena's kindness cleared his mind enough to see it. Maybe that's what hope is, Miguel offered thoughtfully. The young man had been quiet through most of the meal, but when he spoke, there was a maturity in his voice that made him sound older than his years. holding on to something even when you can't see why it matters, giving something even when you can't afford to lose it. Maybe that's how we survive the worst moments, by acting like better times are still possible even when we can't imagine them. They sat with that thought, three people whose lives had been transformed by a single moment of connection, by the decision to see and be seen when it would have been easier to look away. Thomas thought about the question he'd asked at the beginning of all this. Does a single dollar have the power to rewrite the course of two lives forever? He knew the answer now. It wasn't the dollar. It was never about the dollar. It was about the courage to give when giving costs you something, the bravery to receive when receiving means admitting you need help, and the wisdom to recognize that we're all connected in ways we rarely understand until we look back and trace the invisible threads that bind us. In the years that followed, Thomas and Elena stayed in each other's lives. He became something like family to her and Miguel, not because of money or obligation, but because that moment on Mercer Street had created a bond that transcended simple gratitude. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable and recognized something essential, that our worth isn't measured by what we have or what we've lost, but by how we treat each other when we have nothing left to prove and nothing left to gain. The foundation Thomas created helped thousands of people transition from homelessness to stability. Elena eventually became a lawyer specializing in advocacy for immigrants and low-income families, fighting the same systems that had nearly destroyed her own family. Miguel became a doctor, working in underserved communities, never forgetting what it felt like to be $1 away from losing everything. And sometimes late at night when Elena couldn't sleep, she'd take out the dollar bill Thomas had returned to her, framed now, hanging in her office. He'd given it back at that graduation dinner, pressed and preserved, with a small plaque underneath that read, "The most valuable dollar ever spent." She'd look at it and think about the impossibility of knowing which moments will change everything, which small choices will ripple out and reshape lives in ways we never intended and could never predict. She'd think about how we move through our days making 1,000 tiny decisions, most of them forgotten by the time we fall asleep. But every so often, one of those moments matters more than we can imagine. One of those choices becomes the fulcrum on which entire futures balance. And we never know which one it will be. We just have to trust that choosing kindness, choosing to see each other, choosing to give even when giving hurts, that these choices matter even when we can't see how. Because somewhere, someone we'll never know is watching, learning, being shaped by what we do when we think no one's paying attention. Somewhere, a life is waiting to be transformed by a gesture so small we might not even remember making it. Somewhere, the person we help today is the person who will help someone else tomorrow, creating chains of compassion that stretch across years and touch lives that will never know where it all began. That's what Thomas and Elena learned in the space between a doorway and a deli, between despair and hope, between the last dollar and an entire fortune. They learned that we're all both the giver and the receiver, all simultaneously rich and poor in different ways, all capable of saving each other if we're just brave enough to look up from our own struggles, long enough to see who else might need what we have to give. And in the end, maybe that's the only question that really matters. When we have the chance to help someone, even when helping costs us something we can't easily afford to lose, even when we'll never know if it mattered, even when the world gives us every reason to keep walking, what do we choose? Do we stop? Do we see? Do we give? Because sometimes, a single dollar isn't just a dollar. Sometimes, it's everything. Retry T.